I'm told we're live. Welcome. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Peter Karoff, and on behalf of the Karoff Center at the Philanthropic Initiative, welcome to our fourth Tuesdays at TPI Open Forum and Web Teleconference, which today is on the subject of philanthropic leadership. This series is really the latest in TPI's 15-year effort to present information and dialogue around the themes of importance in the area of philanthropy. Last March, on March 9th, our conference was on the subject of trust and transparency, a subject very much related to today's. And our newsletter initiatives, which is on the TPI website, has the summary of that conference. In October, we did a conference on public policy and philanthropy. And all of these are going to be viewable on WGBH's forum website. GBH is filming and recording this, which means it'll be on their website and distributed through the PBS system for 3 years, which is interesting because it gives this conference more legs. Our goals in this series is really to take some issues and try to dig a little deeper, to generate and disseminate some new ideas, and to provide a forum for peer learning, to break down barriers between perception and reality, and above all, to be a truth teller. Thus, our panel is empowered here for the next couple of hours to be truth tellers. For TPI, this is not a passive matter or a passive issue. We work every day with donors who care a great deal about this world and who want to do the right thing. And in today's world, that is not simple. This afternoon, we have about 40 or 50 people here with us in Boston. We're at the Fleet Bank, and we want to make a great big thank you to the Fleet Charitable Asset Division for sponsoring this conference. It's terrific that they have been willing to do this. And we have about 150, 160 people around the country and in Canada. So hello to George Espy in Ohio, to Joe Baldassari in Dayton, to Jennifer Valou in Providence, to Celine Edmonds in St. Joe, to Michael Bangzer in Hartford, to Miyiko Oshima in Los Angeles, and to everyone else out there. We're delighted you're here, and we're delighted that we have begun to understand the power of web conferencing. When we put this panel together, the object was to try to bring a group of people together who would approach the issue of leadership and philanthropic leadership from different perspectives. We wanted certain kinds of voices, and we are extremely pleased that we have with us the group we have today. Their bios are in your material, and for those of you on web on your screen right now, Chad Wick, who is the CEO of the KnowledgeWorks Foundation, which for 5 years has been creating a whole new template around how to approach education reform in Ohio, and has become a statewide leader and also an interesting intermediary for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I've worked with Chad. He is a leader. And those of you who looked at the pre-conference material saw Chad Wick's story, so we know we're dealing with someone who has considerable emotional attachment to this issue. Emmett Carson is the president and CEO of the Minneapolis Foundation, who has doubled the size of that foundation in the 10 years he's been there. He's a leader in the field. He's become an extremely important, critical voice in philanthropy. He is the new chair of the board of the Council on Foundations. Peter Goldberg has been in this business. If it is a business, we should talk about that later. For more than 30 years, he ran 2 corporate foundations, Primerica and Prudential, and for the last 10 years has been the chief executive officer of the Alliance for Children and Families located in Milwaukee. And he just stepped down as chair of the Independent Sector Board. Tim Hall is perhaps the one person on the panel who really understands leadership in a deeply professional way. He's a professor at the Boston University School of Management and the executive director of the Executive Development Roundtable. He's written and studied the issue of leadership for many, many years. We're delighted that Tim is with us. Michelle Corton Brown is one of my heroines in philanthropy and in the city of Boston. She had a distinguished career running the Fleet Charitable Foundation, Fleet Boston Financial Foundation. She's a very gifted leader in this field and is currently the director of the North Region Fleet Charitable Asset Division and is involved in the management of a significant amount of family foundation work. So welcome to you all. And I'm going to turn to the panel right now for just a bit of a teaser. And here's my question. In a sentence or two, what is your view of what philanthropic leadership really means? And we'll begin with Chad.
Well, I'd like to frame my response very quickly, Peter, and first off say thank you for having me here to be with you and my colleagues. But I use a quote from the German philosopher Schopenhauer, and he said, "The task is not so much to see what no one yet has seen, but to think what nobody yet has thought about that which everybody sees." And when you think about the complexities and the challenges facing America today in a profound way about education, health care, and deep social issues, an embedded low-income class, it's very difficult for our public policy system, the political system, to grapple with that because of their the aversion to risk, to really deeply confronting what's wrong with social systems. Corporate philanthropy, I think, is challenged to stay with things long term. So that leaves the independent sector, and within that, particularly the philanthropic sector. So that means to really engage these issues, to sustain and actually get into it and move it, it means providing leadership. And that means perhaps a sustained and broader and deeper role in terms of leading system change out of the philanthropic sector than ever has been in maybe the past 50 years. Because I personally believe the philanthropic sector is best prepared to provide that kind of leadership.
Emmett Carson.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here today.
You're welcome.
Philanthropic leadership to me is being willing to use the myriad tools that we have for the situations that we face. Sometimes that will be a counterweight to government. Sometimes that will be a partner with government. Sometimes that will be to raise questions about businesses. Sometimes that will be to partner with businesses. Sometimes that will be to raise questions with our colleagues within the field, because we don't all share the same view around social issues. Other times it will be to partner with them. Sometimes that's convening, sometimes that's research, sometimes that's innovative projects and thinking out of the box. So leadership is the willingness to be water, to morph into whatever the context of the container is for the good of the larger community. And I think that's what real leadership is, the ability to change and be flexible to circumstances.
Thank you, Emmett. Peter Goldberg.
Wonderful, and thank you again, Peter, for inviting me, for inviting us, and for convening this panel, because this panel really is about the exercise of leadership in the philanthropic sector. And I think it's important that we probably will approach this as leadership for a field rather than leadership for an organization. I think there's a very important distinction there, because the field that we represent is a field that, or a sector that is independent of business and independent of government. It's an independent sector, one striving to shape its identity and to contribute in ways that are differentiated from the business community or from the public sector. So for me, in that sense, the function of philanthropic leadership for this field of ours is to help shape the value proposition of the field, to help shape our values rather than to tell us what to do, to help provide definition for who we are, for what we do, for why we do it and how, and to build confidence in us amongst the public, to build public appreciation in the role of having a vital and vibrant third sector in American society, a sector that can retain its integrity and its vitality and its distinctiveness separate from the fields of business and government.
Thank you, Peter. Douglas Tim Hall.
Thank you, Peter. Bob Galvin, the retired CEO of Motorola, defined a leader as someone who takes you somewhere else. And I would imagine, I'm not an expert in philanthropy, but from just what I've learned so far, I think a big issue for leaders is helping to define that somewhere else. And in your materials, you refer to Kouzes and Posner's work on leadership. They have a wonderful book called The Leadership Challenge, and they define leadership as the art of mobilizing others to want to struggle for shared aspirations. And we use that in our leadership courses because there's so much in there. It says leadership is an art, it's not a science. A lot of experience and life goes into developing people to be leaders. It involves mobilizing others, not forcing others. It's much more of a peer leadership situation now. It involves helping others to want to. So it involves internal motivation, tapping internal motivation, to want to struggle. And the idea is that most change is very difficult. It's tiring, it's frustrating, and people need to be encouraged in a long struggle for shared aspirations. And again, I think for this field, a big issue is just what are those shared aspirations? As Emmett was saying and as Peter was saying, the idea that the field seems to be changing, and what is that new vision going to be seems to be a critical aspect of leadership.
Thank you, Tim. Michelle Corton-Brown.
I would define the definition of philanthropic leadership as the combination of cash and thought leadership. I think there's a real opportunity to have new voices at the table, really leveraging the financial resources that are made available through philanthropy. And I sort of go back to Emmett's point about flexibility. I guess I would describe it as building a rocket ship while in flight. That ability to innovate and to change modes as more data is available, as you hear from constituents, to really make the process transparent and to engage as many new voices as possible. And I just want to thank Peter for giving me the opportunity to participate today, and also add a welcome from Fleet, a Bank of America company. For those of you who see the signs behind us, Fleet is with Bank of America, part of Bank of America.
Thank you for that important clarification, Michelle. Well, I have a friend, Michael Bronner, who's a very intriguing entrepreneur in the Boston area, and one day he was saying to me, you know, we got this great idea, and the secret sauce is, I said, what's secret sauce? He said, well, the secret sauce is that special thing, that thing that gets you cooking. It's a great idea. It's the kernel. It's the hot thing. Well, I have a feeling that the secret sauce of philanthropy is leadership. And whether it's the work is to build the capacity of an organization, or to take an idea and make it happen, or advocate for legislative change, create public will, address social issues, increase support for the arts, the name of the game is impassioned and visionary leadership. One of our goals of this conference is to make it participatory for both our audience as well as those of you who are in webland. And here are a few rules for those of you off-site. During the discussion, you may send a question or a comment to the panel or a specific panelist by using the Q&A dialog box on your screen. Cindy, is there a dialog box on their screen? She's nodding her head that it should be. To send questions, please click on the Q&A tab and type it into the box, then click on Send. If you want to direct it to a specific panelist, type their name at the beginning of the question, keep it short, and remember, we will not be able to answer all questions. You guys here with us in Boston, if you have a question, raise your hand. That's the old-fashioned way of how you want to ask questions. Now, on my left is an interesting character named Steve Johnson, dressed in a helmet like he's running a spaceship. In reality, he is our interlocutor. He is the intermediary between Webland and us. And when Webland has a question, he's going to tell us. And when we do some polls, which we're going to do right now as a test, Steve Johnson will give us the result of the polls. Now, this is for the Webland. And in essence, we can even do it right here in the audience. Here is the first poll. This is just a test. It says, are you a leader? This is slide 12 for those of you watching here with your PowerPoint. Are you a leader? Some say there's a leader in everyone. How many of you would say you have acted at one time or another as a true leader, and how often? 1 is often, 2 is on occasion, 3 is infrequently, 4 is never. So in Webland, type in your answer. How about out here, guys? How many of you would say have often act as a leader? Raise your hand. About 10%, 15% of the room. How many do it on occasion? Almost everybody. Infrequently. 1 or 2 people. Never. You're too embarrassed to admit to never. So, Stephen, do we know? Do we know?
We don't yet know.
Okay, we don't know. All right. While we're knowing, we will move right along. We will move right along, and let's see. There are many types of leadership. There's charismatic, elite, and singular leadership. In Boston, who comes to mind as a charismatic leader? Shout out a name. Who's a charismatic leader? Marion Hurd. Who else? Charismatic leader. Who's charismatic? Who was charismatic? Kevin White. Boston mayor, and Marion Hurd was United Fund director. Lenny Zakem, Boston hero. National, international, charismatic? Jack Welch. Quiet, unassuming moral leadership. Who comes to mind? Who's somebody who comes to mind? Quiet, unassuming moral leadership.
Desmond Tutu.
Desmond Tutu. Who else?
John Gardner.
John Gardner. Who else? Kofi Annan. Interesting. And then there's collective community bottom-up leadership. Who comes to mind as someone who's built leadership from the bottom? Mel King. Gene Rivers. 2 Boston leaders of the African American community. Who else comes to mind? A national, international figure who's collective bottom-up. Saul Alinsky. Well, obviously there are many different types of leadership. The complaint, the concern that you hear over and over again is there isn't enough. And there isn't enough of the right kind. And we don't trust our leaders. And the session we did on March 9th, some of you were participatory in that, talked about the erosion of trust in this society. It's a serious, serious issue. And then there are challenges that are often talked about relevant to leadership. The society's pluralism. Many, many voices at the table. Everyone wants to be heard, has changed the nature of leadership in this world. And smoke-filled rooms doesn't do it anymore, if it ever did. Decision-making is therefore harder, more time-consuming. And trust in leaders is at an all-time low. Stephen, do we know how often our web audience has been a leader?
Peter, the vote is in from cyberspace. We've got a lot of leaders out there. 40% are often leaders. 30% are occasionally leaders. No one is never a leader.
My Lord. What an incredibly good group. We obviously have the wrong group signed up for this conference. Well, let's go to the first real question to our distinguished panel, and it's really this. Do we need something new? If these are some of the complaints and the challenges, does philanthropic leadership as we know it have to be reinvented in some way? Does it have to be reinvented in some way? And who would like to go first on that one?
Well, sure, Peter. I think it absolutely has to be, because the world has changed so dramatically. If we had leadership that was exactly of the old-style models of leadership, it would be old leadership for a new era. We have new forms of communication. We have new forms of technology. We have new forms of globalism. Everything about our world and many things about our communities are changing. Many things are changing about how institutions relate to communities and to individuals. To think that we could have old-style leadership in a new-style era, I think, is a little bit almost an oxymoron. I mean, it's not going to happen. So we are going to have to. We can't just romanticize about the past. I think we have to look to the future. I think that the future kinds of leadership and the definitions of leadership in the future are going to be of necessity different than the past. So it's not recreating, it's reinventing. It's looking at a changing environment and being adaptable enough to forecast what those kinds of leadership characteristics and attributes might be about.
Chad?
I'd add on to that new systems are being created, and that systems will evolve in a healthy way if they're based on relationships of trust. If the participants are fed information, and if there is a leadership that can sustain a long-term support of providing atmospheres of trust and feed good information into the creation of these new systems. And I think there's where philanthropy can play an enormously important role to be that long-term provider of information, atmospheres of trust, and create relationships that can, in fact, create healthy systems.
What would be an example, Chad, in your mind of that?
Well, our education system essentially was an outgrowth of the industrial era formed a century ago. We need to rethink fundamentally. Even the vernacular is wrong. We need to talk about schooling, not schools. And where that happens, it's a whole new way of thinking. And if that system is to be redesigned, there has to be what is more public than our public schools, and yet it's going to take a deep amount of trust and so many participants and a lot of information and a lot of support for a period of time to allow this new system to be created, and that's a role philanthropy can play.
Well, I've given this some thought, and I think that I think that there is an opportunity for us as the funding community. I think for a long time we've been challenging our community partners around the issue of capacity building. And I think there's a fair amount of capacity building opportunity among the funders to really explore in greater detail the new set of needs that our society is facing, and to get beyond our comfort level, whether it's geographic, whether it's category of giving, and really spend some time understanding the needs from the constituents we seek to serve. I think sometimes as we move further up the totem pole, if you will, in philanthropic leadership, we are making decisions based on our historical knowledge. And I do think that there is a challenge around the sense of urgency that we have as a society on issues that have been around for a very long time. And I think some of that comes from just not being as refreshed as we need to be on an ongoing basis and becoming re-educated on the issues that we seek to address.
Are you suggesting that the foundation world should take some of its own advice
Exactly.
that it constantly gives to the nonprofit world?
Exactly.
That's a dangerous thing. In the essay, Sleepwalkers, an essay on confusion that many of you have seen. Emmett, I made the case that too many Americans are not engaged in the work of the society, that the American social contract is at risk, with poverty as the example, that we're a house divided, the commons is lost, and the philanthropic we is confused. What does that do to the issue of reinventing, if you agree with any of that, the issue of reinventing philanthropic leadership?
I've been struggling with your question, and I'm going to answer it a different way than my colleagues here. And I'm going to suggest that we need to renew, not necessarily reinvent, philanthropic leadership. I'm going to suggest that, in fact, we aren't living up to our glorious past. I mean, I think about Julius Rosenwald going into the Deep South after the Civil War, creating educational opportunities for African Americans at severe risk. I think about Carnegie creating a vision for libraries. I don't see that kind of bold, innovative leadership today from our major institutions. Certainly the context will be different. Certainly the issues are different today. But where is that bold leadership on civil rights for gay and lesbians? Where is that bold leadership around AIDS in the global community? Where is that bold leadership around the health disparities, the educational disparities? So that I don't, certainly there are different times, but I think that we are far too timid when you look at our past of what foundations used to engage with the big ideas, whether they worked or not, the Ford Foundation's Gray Areas programs. I mean, we used to think, public television, and Fred Friendly that came out of Ford. I mean, we used to think big about transformation of society. And somewhere along the line, I think we started to think small. And so I don't know if it's necessarily reinventing as opposed to renewing what we used to do and used to expect, whether it worked or not. That was the risk. That was the innovation. That was what we sold. I don't think we're doing any of that today. And I think, in fact, by looking to our past, it can embolden us to take on a future, our distant past, to embolden us to say that's what we ought to be about. That's what we have done in the past. And I think if we separate ourselves too much and say, well, that's all the past and this is now different, we don't have anything to give us the backbone and the steel that we may need. But when you say, well, our colleagues did it before, it's part of our DNA, it's easier to believe that you've done it before and you can do it again rather than it's all new and it's all different. And we're starting without any of that history. Then that gets real daunting.
You know, Peter, I agree entirely with Emmett, and I think that one of the challenges facing us in that regard is the focus in this day and age on measurements and outcomes, particularly in philanthropy, when in effect what's happening is foundations and nonprofit organizations are being driven to do what they can measure, as opposed to figuring out how to measure what it is we should be doing. And the outcomes measurements that are in place tend to drive us to think incrementally. They tend to drive us to think small. They mitigate against big vision. They mitigate against the functions of advocacy, against being a conscience, because all of those kinds of things are much tougher to measure. So in response to certain public skepticisms, we implemented a series of outcome measurements in this field, both for foundations and nonprofits, that are diminishing us rather than strengthening us.
Could I just tag on to what Emmett was saying? I really like the idea of thinking big, and also when you were talking before about the need to be flexible and respond to the situation. I guess my vision would be, it would be wonderful if we could think big and think small, because I think one of the changes in leadership today, certainly you see it in other kinds of organizational leadership, is I think we've really moved away from what you might call the heroic model, where you have one leader and 4,999 followers. And I think we're trying to create situations where you have 5,000 leaders. And I think an important part of leadership now is creating other leaders, helping other leaders grow. So I think another thing we can be doing, we certainly see it in work organizations now. We're seeing more and more of our recent graduates who are really concerned about making a contribution. In business schools, MBA students now, I think, are very values-driven. We've sort of come beyond the era of the 90s where everybody wanted to be a big entrepreneur and make a lot of money. And maybe some still want to do that, but they want to do work that they think is worth doing and be part of some sort of mission that they can identify with and take pride with. So I think one of the functions of philanthropic leaders is to help kind of small leaders find outlets, find ways of serving that will really be very, very satisfying to them. And I think in the area of thinking big, it seems to me we do have examples of strong philanthropic leadership today. I think we need to tell those stories more. We need to communicate that more. There may be a tendency for some people to do their leadership in a very quiet way, a very private way, so we lose some of the inspirational effect of that, the modeling effect of that. I looked up in preparation for this Pierre Omidyar's commencement address at Tufts. He's the founder of eBay, and now he's spending most of his time in philanthropic work. And he was very modest on his website, which is supposed to be where he's communicating what he and his wife Pam are doing. It's very, very modest. I mean, there's a lot of encouragement for what other people might do, but there isn't as much about some of the specific things he's doing as there might be. So I don't mean to focus just on him, but I think there are a lot of people who are exerting leadership like that, and I think we can communicate, tell those stories better so that there's more impact from them.
I'd like to go out to our audiences, and I'm going to move to our participant poll number 2, which is slide 20 for those of you here in Boston, which asks a question. Is that now up on our webland group? Cindy Hanchar, who's running this? It is. Okay.
Just about to go out, Peter.
Why? And here's the question. Why has philanthropy failed too often to take on needed leadership? And I like the way it's been presented. Emmett saying we don't think big enough, and Tim Hall reminding us we perhaps don't think small enough in some ways. And we list several factors which might be important. So the question to our web audience, which of these factors has been most important? 1, too many silos, we don't collaborate enough. 2, too much ego, we overestimate our abilities. 3, too little money. 4, too little staying power, we're fickle and move on. 5, too timid, too safe. And 6, overwhelmed by options and issues. And I'm curious here in Boston whether anyone would venture which of these. We're asking our web group to pick one. Which one of these is the most important? How about here in Boston? How many of you? Which of these 6 would you say are most important? Gary Smith has a comment.
Too many silos, not enough collaboration, because I think there is and I think a lot of these other factors are present, but I see so many organizations focused on the same issue, which is great. I'm not saying that there should be big umbrella organizations, but there's plenty more room for collaboration and strength in numbers.
Any other comment from our audience here in Boston? Or anything on this list that you think would be? Ed Toomey from the New England Aquarium.
I would second the comment on too many silos, but add to it the bullet here that talks about too timid or too safe. I think there are new definitions of risk involved for philanthropists and decision makers in philanthropy that have to do with personal and sometimes professional loss in that process. The time to make decisions is shorter, and I think the risk has heightened. I was very struck by what Emmett said about the big risks that people used to take. The risks take on different characters. And I think philanthropy right now is a risky business, and that has to be topped up. So I think there's a timidity associated with it that hurts the professional process itself.
I have to tell you that in the TPI experience in the last several years, especially almost in the last 18 months, a number of our clients have been using a word which I don't remember hearing before. It's the word transformational. I was working on a mission statement for a family foundation in actually Minneapolis, Emmett, in which the term is to be transformational through the support, in this case, of Catholic education. We have another client that really is looking at a way to find a cure for diabetes. That word, you wouldn't be able to use that word. You probably still can't, but people are using that aspiration. So that dream of wanting to do something large is really still there.
And I think it's fair to say that we do have some, and Emmett's point is well taken, but the Gates Foundation, I mean, they have announced to create a vaccine, to prevent AIDS. I think they're taking on the most intractable part of American public education today when no one else would. The American high school, and a low-performing high school, an enormously complex issue. And there are other, at education at least, foundations, the Illumina Foundation, and others who are really stepping out and taking on major issues that need to be explored. Accountability in higher education, the Illumina Foundation, for instance. It's a major issue, and I think they're taking a lot of risk.
There are other examples that certainly Ted Turner's gift to the UN Foundation is an example of a major thing, and the things that George Soros has done over time. And we're very impressed with a foundation, a tiny one in Owensboro, Kentucky, the Public Life Foundation of Owensboro, where Rodney Barker, who is the executive director of that, was on our panel in October. A very tiny foundation, truly trying to deal with the major issues of that region. Steve Johnson, do we have any questions from Webland?
We do have a question from Webland, but before I give you that, I should tell you that the cyber jury is very much in agreement with what we've heard here. The overwhelming choice was too many silos, followed by too timid, too safe, and in third place, too little staying power. So there's a lot of parallelism there.
Before we get to the question, I would like to add two other elements that were brought to my attention earlier by one of my very smart colleagues, and that is we don't listen, and we're just not inclusive enough as a field. We don't listen very well. We're very good at, maybe like we're doing today, my gosh, we're very good at talking.
Question from cyberspace, from our friend Al Wallace over at Brown Rudnick. Roughly put, how important is it to have a vision of an important social mission in order to be an effective philanthropic leader?
Okay, mission. Emmett.
I think it's very important, and it's because I think it's that vision that allows you to stay the course when things get tough. I mean, when you showing leadership is often about who you're willing to provoke. And once you've provoked people, it's not a negative way, it's that you want to change. You're changing the status quo, and so you get a reaction. It's that vision that allows you to stay the course in the face of opposition. And so you can use that to, again, steel yourself up to say, this is worth the challenge, because we're trying to make the cure. So don't give up because this part failed. We're going to cure this yet. Keep at it. Or we're going to transform this educational system. Stay at it. It's that vision that gives you that motivation to continue on the path. When you look to that vision and it's lacking, in that regard. Then you encounter some difficulty. I think it's far easier to back off and pick another path and pick an easier path. So I think it's critical, particularly when you want to engage in these more difficult leadership items.
I could add, and if I could add another element, when you're talking about social change, you're talking about very complex, very large systems, and vision absolutely is part of any great leader. Absolutely has to have vision. But systems are totally unpredictable because systems aren't inanimate things; they're people. And if you tried to predict it, that's just unrealistic to where it's going to go. So, in fact, I think it's passion. I think you have to have passion to stay the course and know that it may, in fact, go lots of directions. But, in fact, if you can stick with it and keep within your integration with the issue, trusting relationships so that people, in fact, gravitate to healthy change and not change out of fear, then you might get somewhere productive, but don't forget passion.
Do you think that, just a question for Tim Hall, the issue of the emotive aspect of nonprofit philanthropic work, the fact that it is mission-driven, the heart piece, is in classical business leadership definitions, how big is the passion part as opposed to the more linear?
Well, we have a concentration in our MBA program in public and nonprofit management, and a related one in healthcare management. And it's interesting to me. Emma was talking about how the vision keeps you going when times get rough. The MBA program is pretty rough, especially in the first term. People talk about the boot camp kind of experience, and I think the people who come in both in the public and nonprofit and in the healthcare concentration with a real sense of what their work is in the world, it's not that the work is easier for them, but it certainly does sustain them in what they're doing, and it infects other people. I can see it has an effect on other people's motivation. And I think in general what we're finding is that to do any kind of work you have to have passion, that there has to be kind of a path with the heart to really keep people going. So in some ways this kind of work I think could be a good model for people doing other kinds of work.
Interesting. Peter?
I just offer, I think that vision is very, very important. I don't think anybody would argue with that. I'd just add, though, that I think that vision can be much more powerful when it's combined with values, because it's the values that help provide the guidance for how you're going to track along that journey to reach that vision. And I think in many of our organizations, we don't spend enough time on vision and values, and we spend probably too much time on goals and objectives. And that's part of that thinking small. It's also part of aiming low, of being safe. So, our cultures, in that sense, have been transformed in some kind of way for some reasons that have led us away from thinking about vision and values and focusing in on goals, objectives, and tactics. All too often, nonprofits, when they're seeking funds, are asked about measurements, goals, objectives, and even though we're supposed to be mission-driven organizations, we may be asked for a mission statement, but we're never asked how we measure our accomplishments on our mission statement. We're rarely asked about our vision and our values.
I think one thing related to that, one implication then is, in terms of how we develop our leaders, that we have to do more to get people reflecting on what those values are for them, and that when we have people coming into organizations or when we see them come into MBA programs, it's very tempting for us to get right into the business of training them, giving them the skills they want, or maybe in your organizations of socializing them and getting them doing the work they want to do. But I think it's really important to give them a chance to do some looking inside, some reflection on their experiences, how did they happen to come to where they are right here? What are my values? Who am I? What do I want to do? So there's a level of self-awareness I think people have to have so they're really clear on those values, and we have to help them kind of develop that self-awareness.
There is an operational thing, though, that Peter was going to, and what struck me is many years ago, I was on the board of the Mass Association for Mental Health, and the chair of that board then was Elizabeth Rawlings, who a lovely woman who taught at Simmons College, and we used to get in these massive, terrible, endless meetings about the commissioner and the budget and the this and the that, and every once in a while she would raise her hand, wait a minute, this discussion is not good for our mental health. Bang, right back to mission, right back to values. Fascinating.
And Peter, what you raised there, too, is something that we haven't touched upon yet, which is the relationship between governance of our organizations and leadership, because I think sometimes when we think about leadership, we start to think about staff leadership, about CEOs, and all too often in these kinds of conversations, we fail to address the issues about governance and leadership, because ultimately it is our boards of directors who have to empower and enable the leaders to take those leadership paths, to have leaders who can express the courage of their convictions, the willingness to take a risk, and the fortitude to stay with it. Governance is very, very important to this discussion.
Michelle?
I was going to say that one of the other byproducts of focusing on tasks is that it feels like it's more manageable. And I think in a society that is very goal-oriented, it's much easier to focus on the tasks at hand and be able to check them off. But focusing on the values, I think, is the fuel for longevity. And I think one of the biggest challenges I've seen in philanthropy across the board is the inability to stay focused and to celebrate even small wins, understanding that this is a long-term phenomenon that we're trying to change. And I think sometimes there's frustration. I've certainly seen it in the public education arena, where if people don't see an immediate change in test scores or see an immediate change in governance in the schools, there's sort of a throwing up of one's hands and, well, we can't fix the problem. When in fact it took us longer than a minute, I think, to get to that situation. It's going to take us much longer to find effective solutions. So I really celebrate this notion of focusing on values and vision, because that's really where the aspiration and the fuel to keep us moving comes from.
And to your point, a person who was a mentor to both Peter Goldberg and myself, Mike Sverdov, used to say, to Michelle's point, he would look you in the eye and he'd wave his fingers. Remember, social change is incremental at best. Remember that. And I'm told from Steve Johnson we've got a great question.
Well, I think it's a great question. It's from our friend Ilan Goranzik. Ilan asks, isn't one of the problems of leadership the professionalization of big philanthropy over the past 20-plus years? And yes, I appreciate the irony in my asking this question. Professionals, understandably, may be reluctant to take risks and jeopardize their jobs.
Aha. What do you think, you guys, with those jobs?
I lost mine.
I don't think that, with due deference to Ilan, I don't think that the challenge is the professionalization. And I say that because the boards are volunteer. And so when the boards are volunteer, the boards aren't. The question is, do you have a board that's saying to you, bring me innovative things that will change the world, or change our community, or change this neighborhood, or change this block? Or do you have a board that's saying, I don't want those things, I want to fit in? I think the professional staff want to keep their jobs, but they keep their jobs by getting in line with the tone that the board sets. And if the board says, I don't want any nasty headlines, I don't want any controversy, I don't want any of those things, or your job is in jeopardy, then professional staff say, I hear you, I want to pay for my kids' college, and you won't see any of those things. And when a board says, look, go out there, make things happen, I'll stick by you, take risks, it'll be okay. In fact, you'll get promoted for taking risks, you'll get more responsibility, then I think you have an organization that behaves that way. So I don't think it's the professional staff that creates the leadership or the lack of the leadership. I think it's the board setting the tone for that professional staff. And in fact, they're more likely to jump in the direction of the board because they've got that hook called a paycheck. Volunteers walk away when they get disgruntled. I'm not being fulfilled, so goodbye. Staff, hang on because I need that job. And the question is, what job are you putting them to task to do? And I would argue the task very seldom is for those big or small transformational things. It's more status quo, be safe, things that are good. I don't want to be misinterpreted. They are a net good to society, but they are maintenance good things, not transformative change things.
I do think there's an issue with risk-taking. I can't recall the last time a program officer got a pat on the back for funding something that failed. And I think that we've lost something in our willingness to have failures. We certainly have failures on the for-profit side all the time. In fact, most great entrepreneurs failed once or twice before they had the great success. But somehow or another, there's less wiggle room these days for nonprofits to take risks and to fail, and to have that be a learning as opposed to a failure.
Now, we may be an anomaly, but at KnowledgeWorks, we've got enormous latitude. Perhaps that's because we had Peter Karoff come in and facilitate our board retreats to help me get the board to have a very large vision. But we have an atmosphere that begs for us to take risks, to be bold. But it is the board. I absolutely agree. It all comes from this empowered board to really generate that feeling of responsiveness in our staff.
I think Michelle is on to something, though, with the inability of the foundation world to really deal with failure as a learning process all this venture philanthropy and the analog to venture capital, 2 out of 10 venture capital deals make it maybe. How many foundations would be happy with saying only 2 of their grants were successful? It just doesn't happen. There's a question coming from Hal Shear back there, right behind you, Susan.
Is that mic working?
Is that mic working?
Is there a switch on it?
That's working? Should be.
Okay. No.
Okay. I'll speak loudly.
Thank you.
How's that? I'm curious. Working. I'm curious as to the question of boards and governance. We call an effective board a strategic asset board, do you all have any insight as to when you see those boards, whether the leadership in fact comes out of that as a consequence, and have you seen a difference in the organizations being able to find and promote a strategic asset board? In other words, how often do you see that, and is there anything you can share with us in terms of why a board becomes a strategic asset? Do you need the kind of support that KnowledgeWorks has from a major donor who gives you that flexibility in order to, and Peter come in to facilitate in order to get to that, or can you take an older line foundation and get to the same point? What's the distinguishing characteristic?
Well, in the case of KnowledgeWorks being a relatively new organization, 5 years old, and the board really committed itself to being bold and wanting to address this point in bringing education into the 21st century, and understood it was taking a lot of risks. Because we partner with a lot of large national foundations, I think the aspect of history and tradition and all of these things that keep them from being as we are, fresh, new, willing to take on the world. There's a real difference between our organizations that maybe Emmett or Peter can talk about. But I think we've been very, very fortunate to have a fresh, open view at the very beginning.
Well, there's certainly a leadership element in governance as well. It has to do with building the trust and the confidence, the relationship with the staff, to empower a staff, to lead a board. Is to trust the staff, especially in a point in time in which there's so much skepticism, so much focus in on accountability. It takes a tremendous governing leader to enable, empower, and inspire a staff to carry out its leadership functions. Not that the staff carries them out separate and divorced from the board, but the relationships between the board and the staff are very special. They change with individuals. They change with individual CEOs, and they change with individual board chairs. So the leadership function that has to take place within the governing culture is very important, only beginning, I think, to be addressed a little bit more now than it has been. For instance, in nonprofit boards, if you will, the message of the 1980s and the 1990s was use your nonprofit board to raise money. That was what governance was about. The message in this decade is really more about governing and building the right kinds of governance structures for nonprofit organizations. The relationship in foundations between foundation staffs and CEOs on the one hand and foundation boards, I think, is yet to be really addressed very carefully. But when we decry leadership in American philanthropy, I don't think it's sufficient to just say it's the staff leaders. I think we really have to look at the governance function of American foundations and see what's taking place there that either contributes or mitigates against the culture of leadership in American philanthropy.
Emmett?
I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. I'll stop there.
All right. Any other comment on this? And I'd like to go out to our audiences with another poll, and it's slide 18 on your PowerPoint, and I think it may be now going up on our webland. And with this question, there are a set of leadership characteristics that we see over and over again, and each one is useful at times. We're going to ask our audience to pick the three that are the most important for effective philanthropic leadership. So please choose the three most important characteristics. One is a visionary who is inspirational, is a collaborator or a bridger, a consensus builder, is a disruptor who takes risks, is a mentor who guides, supports others, is an exemplar, a model of best practices, is a moral authority who sets standards, is a catalyst who makes things happen. And okay, web audience, do your voting. And how about here in Boston? When you look at these, who would venture to say that three of these are the most important? And which three? Who has a response to that? Sharon Driscoll from Fleet.
I would go with, I think, visionary, because I think that really sets a tone for all the others, or inspires a lot of the others to come along. Collaborator, because in things that are big and bold, it is going to, as Chadwick was saying, it takes an awful lot of participants in systems or people, and there are an awful lot of contributors. And then I think, I mean, all of these are good, but I think the catalyst who makes things happen is, I would pick as the third.
Anyone? Thank you, Sharon. Anyone else here in Boston? David Ford from the Richard and Susan Smith Foundation.
You can really pick any three of them. I sort of like the counterplay between being a collaborator, a bridge, and a consensus builder, and also being a disruptor who takes risks. You can pull both of those off either at the same time or sequentially. That would be a pretty good combination.
David, who in your mind is a disruptor?
Bill Clinton.
Anyone in philanthropy that's a disruptor?
Peter, I would like to just add one more.
Ron Ankrum from
and this is an earlier conversation Emmett and I had earlier, which is mentor. And I think anyone who others would seek advice or support from really says that they respect that person, see that person as a leader. And so, and those who want to be mentors, I think basically understand the need to support others in doing their work.
Interesting.
And I would say that Emmett is a disruptor on occasion.
Don't tell.
I'm going to have to tell something about Emmett. Emmett came to Boston to be on this panel. He was supposed to arrive in the office at 11. He gets in the office at 12. Where was he? At Philine's basement shopping. Do we have any responses from Webland, Steve Johnson?
We do. This time it's unambiguous. The virtual vote has named a winner. The winner is a visionary, with 60% of the respondents making that one of their three choices, followed by collaborator, followed by catalyst, which isn't on my screen, then collaborator, then mentor.
Interesting. Well, to the panel, here's a question for you. And it builds on these elements, and especially one of them that wasn't really referenced. Leading an organization or an institution is one thing. Leading community or societal change is another, and we've kind of referenced that. At our March 9th Tuesdays at TPI forum that looked at the crisis and trust, we talked a lot about trust. But what implication do you think the decline in trust has for effective role for philanthropy as a moral leader? Or can you even say that? Is that just too pretentious to even say that? What do you think, Michelle?
Yes, I would try to answer this slightly differently. I do think that the crisis in trust is real, but I think that this is a new reality that we're living in, and that we need to accept that most people are motivated by their own set of self-motivated interests, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But I do think that we do... how do I say this nicely? I do think that we do have a challenge around moral leadership. I think we see that demonstrated most in our young people, who seem very skeptical of our leadership, whether it's political or their parents, or institutions that we hold dear, like marriage. And I think that if we don't find a way to engage and begin to walk the talk in a more consistent way, that we're going to lose this generation and a lot of the value that they bring to the party.
I think just to tag on to that, I think the implication is maybe that we need leaders to practice their leadership in different ways. So walking the talk, modeling, being a good role model, maybe not making great claims for what you're doing necessarily, just let your actions speak for yourself, as opposed to trying to inspire people directly or challenge them and have it all depend on that. And I think also by activities like really enabling, empowering, trying to get other people involved in the work, and then providing the encouragement, when it does get to be a struggle, and celebrating the small wins, as Michelle was saying. That these are all different practices that the research has shown that great leaders employ. So I think they have to be more flexible, and maybe some of these other practices, but especially ones involving personal behavior and modeling may be more important.
So you think you get there not through perhaps the rhetoric or the grand gesture. You get there by the day-to-day doing.
Mm-hmm. Do as I do, not just what I say.
Right. Alan McDonald has a question from the Mass Business Roundtable.
That may be true if you're talking about leadership that you like or that you want to see as a model, but how about Al Capone or Saddam Hussein or Nikita Khrushchev or other people that may have had a different idea about what moral values are, or
ethics or what's good for the common person. They might all be leaders, the people I mentioned, but they may not have the moral qualities that you're looking for in a leader that you want.
Well, I think that's why it's important for individuals to really engage in some self-reflection, get clear on what their values are, what direction they want to go in, what direction do they want to be led in, because I think it does mean leadership for what? And there's certainly leadership for evil as well as for good. And I think people who haven't really thought about that are real candidates to be exploited by other people. People may have kind of a set of some vision of what they'd like to do in the world, but if they haven't really thought through their own personal mission and they're willing to kind of buy into an organizational mission, then there's a risk that they may be kind of seduced by the wrong kind of leader.
Emmett?
Two points on this. One, and again, maybe to be the disruptor that David has accused me of being. First, I want to say that I believe there's a relationship between moral leadership and the level of public trust. And that when you don't exercise moral leadership, you lose the public trust. And I want to get at this notion because I think it hits our field of nonprofits and philanthropy harder than most. I think we have to be a lot more public in that moral leadership. I don't think it's acceptable to say, well, we do it quietly behind the scenes, particularly when we have actors who aren't doing it the right way and exhibiting moral leadership. I look at the business community. They failed to speak out against Enron. I look at the mutual fund industry that's going through scandal now. I look at the Catholic Church that's been impacted because they didn't exhibit the moral leadership that they should have at a particular point in time. And I think you can look at all those lessons and say there are people who, oh, it's not all of us, and the public will see the majority of us are doing it the right way, and those are our colleagues, and we don't want to comment on it. And each of those industries have been virtually destroyed in terms of moral leadership, and their public trust has gone to lows. I think we're at the cusp of having to decide, are we going to follow that example, or are we going to say out loud, those folk who aren't exhibiting moral leadership, they don't represent us, they aren't the best in this field. We have as much outrage about that behavior as any other normal citizen. In fact, we have more outrage because we recognize how those actions will negatively impact a field and a profession and a sector that relies on volunteers, volunteer contributions, volunteer time. People give it because they choose to. They aren't compelled to. And so when you lose trust for us, the implications are far larger than for the other sectors. So I want to say there's not enough to just do our own thing quietly. I think that's part of the problem, and that's been the problem in the other sectors. I think we have to do what we know most of us, or believe most of us are doing, but I think we've got to be a lot more public with people who do it wrong, and that will require a lot of courage on our part, because this would be different for us. This is a new context that Peter was telling. We're in a new place. And you say, well, how do you do it? And I'm going to be brief on this. You do it like this. You say, if the charges are true, they need to be investigated and locked up. If the charges are true, that does not represent what this field is about. If the charges are true, somebody needs to be fired and heads need to roll. That's what they do in sports. That's what they do in business. That's what they do in all other walks of life. When confronted with moral questions, people aren't silent. They say, if what you're saying is true, I don't have access to the facts. But if those facts bear out, we hate it, it's wrong, it shouldn't have happened, and the harshest consequences ought to occur.
If the charges are true, would you kick them out of the council and foundations?
Absolutely.
Emmett,
and we have policies to do that.
Just as a sidelight, I'm not so sure I would hold up sports as a bastion of morality in American society.
Well, but they understand protecting the franchise.
Yes. Peter, I think I just want to come back to Al's comments, though, too, because observations, because I think they're very important, which is we could see the grounds for the evolution of a kind of moral leadership that we may not like. And I think that the decline in trust in our sector is a precondition or exposes us to the vulnerability of greater government regulation, which could indeed create the conditions for the development of a sense of morality in philanthropic and nonprofit leadership that may be very narrow, may be very pejorative, may work against the kinds of values and cultures that we've been trying to create, may work towards greater homogeneity at a point in time in which we have to value greater diversity in our field. So I've wrestled with this question because I'm not quite sure I know yet what moral leadership would mean and what it stands for, but it could stand. I mean, it could stand for a lot of different things. Who could be against moral leadership? Well, that's hard to be against, but there is somewhat of a devil in the details aspect of this that really, whose morality are we talking about? Because some of the very, very best examples that we might cite in terms of the contributions of philanthropy and nonprofit organizations in the history of our society may very well at that time have been labeled by people, maybe even a majority of people, as crossing lines of morality. So whose morality are we talking about? And the decline of public trust leading to government regulation, seeding new forms of moral leadership may not be everything we want it to be.
It's interesting because this issue of whose morality, I was with a very dear friend and client who is extremely conservative, and he said to me, you know what bothers me most? We're losing. The conservatives are losing in America. And I said, that's very interesting, because all the liberals I know are convinced that they're losing in America. And I think that's true. I think both extremes think they're losing, and it's the sleepwalkers that we need to wake up. We're going to try an amazing feat of technology right now. We're going to attempt to call our friend Nancy Roberts, who's the president of the Connecticut Council for Philanthropy, who's at the Lyceum in Hartford, Connecticut, a beautiful building recently rehabilitated for the public good by the Melville Charitable Trust. And we're going to now ask Nancy, hey Nancy, how are you today? Do you have a question? And you're with some others I know, some other good Connecticut folks. Do you have a question for our panel, or do you have a comment? Nancy.
Okay. Peter, great question. Great question. She's lost in cyberspace. She will call in shortly.
She'll be with us shortly. All right. So much for technology.
Leadership is about flexibility.
Leadership is about flexibility. This panel is about flexibility. Okay, we have another question from here in Boston while we're waiting for Nancy to come online.
Peter, one of the questions that I have is, as you talk about, for example, moral leadership, a lot of the responses sound about moral leadership for the field as a field, and maybe the issues of accountability and behavior of the field. But there's also the issue of moral leadership, or any of these things applied to the particular areas that foundations are working in. And I suspect that if you ask some of the funders, and maybe significant funders in areas, they really see that the work going to some of the quiet work idea is with the organizations that they partner with, and the leadership comes from the collective efforts, whether it be on environmental issues or health issues or whatever it might be. And I guess I'd just like to hear more about we're treating it in some respects as one field, and there are a lot of you can look at it broken up into a variety of program areas or issues that are compelling issues in the world. You can also look at it as the funders, the foundations, and the nonprofits, and are there distinctions that we should be making between in the roles that each can play in terms of leadership, because it's not one large field.
Well, it's an enormously challenging question because our plurality is multiplying, And I think that's probably good because it's probably one of the core values of this field is a pluralism, a multiplicity of thoughts, of ways of doing things. And we have to create the environment that encourages and allows that. We also probably have to create certain parameters that beyond which it can, operations and can't penetrate for legal reasons. I think we do have to be able to have some code of ethics. Independent sector has been very forceful and persuasive, I think, in encouraging organizations to adopt codes of ethics, to have whistleblower protection, to provide some of those basics. But when you get to the functions, we are just, not only are we multiplying, we're growing. And this is a field that is growing exponentially. One of the big fears that we always have in a field is when you're going through exponential growth, it's always hard to impose quality control, especially quality control on an unregulated field, which allows, therefore, for ventures that may go beyond the bounds of what is defined as acceptable. So we're wrestling with what I think is a tremendous amount of growth, ambiguity, uncertainty, volatility within our field that does, at points in times, create a, if not a sense of chaos, at least a sense of disorganization. And in disorganization, there are healthy aspects of disorganization, particularly for this field, but there can also be some unhealthy attributes as well.
Michelle, when you were running Fleet Financial Foundation and thus dealing with having to respond to thousands and thousands of nonprofit requests, how did you go at that question?
Well, I think we went at it a number of ways.
And still remain beloved in the city. I mean, that's the other thing.
Well, I think the way that we approached it was by having a strategy, because clearly I used to run the Travelers Insurance Companies Foundation many, many years ago, and I never had the experience of having someone say, I have an insurance policy with you, and so I care about the Rotary Club, and I'd like you to care about the Rotary Club. That was a regular occurrence in my days running the foundation, where we'd get calls in from people who would let us know to the dollar how much money they had on deposit at the bank, and they wanted us to understand that they wanted us to be invested in what they were invested in. So I think having a strategy allowed us to make key decisions. I think that it also provided us with the opportunity to be able to articulate what we were about, and going back to the, say what you do and then do what you say. We were sort of afforded that opportunity to do that. And it also allowed us to articulate when we said no, why, and to also sort of total up our commitment in a way that people could understand the impact that we were seeking to achieve.
It didn't stop you from being a leader in issues that you cared about.
Exactly. When we said yes in a big way. And often that yes came with not just the philanthropic support, but with executive leadership, with the utilization of our government affairs capabilities, our volunteer capabilities. I'm looking at my colleague, Catherine Christer, who is still with the Fleet Boston Financial Foundation. I can't tell you how many hours the staff told in meetings that had nothing to do with a specific grant, but had everything to do with social change. So I think it's about being invested and being invested in a big way.
A small plug, if you want to read more about how Michelle did this, there is a book that has just been published by TPI Editions called Just Money, a critique of contemporary American philanthropy, and Michelle's chapter in that book talks about that. Do we have a question, or do we have Nancy?
We have Nancy and a question.
Hey, Nancy, how are you?
Well, she's not too well at the moment.
She's great, but she's on hold.
She's on hold. Well, then, I'm about to go out to the
would you like a question from
Absolutely.
cyberspace?
We're very open here, Steve.
Here is a
open, transparent panel. Let's have your question. Absolutely.
Here is a question from cyberspace from a national leader in the field who wishes to remain anonymous for reasons known only to her. What are the characteristics of transformational work?
What a
Not
great
being
question.
anonymous.
In case any of you missed that, not being anonymous was Emmett.
Another, I couldn't top that.
That was Mrs. Carson asking the question.
I think being transformational means a commitment to serious, authentic public engagement about the work. It isn't just work done between the philanthropy and the system, but engaging, if it's to be transformational, that there is serious, sustained, authentic, deep public dialogue about it, and that the public is really seen as owners and not just consumers, and that they are really helped to with information that philanthropy can provide to make and be participants as partners in this. That is, to me, part of transformational. And we're doing work, to be specific, about taking a whole city's high schools and completely transforming, and that's the word we use, transformational. Part of this is a deep and sustained, and we try and hope that it's authentic, because we go way beyond focus groups and things like this to get around all the corners, to get to the people that normally don't participate in these discussions. But that, we hope, becomes a part of what you might call transformational.
I think and to Tim Hall's earlier point, we have a good friend who provides relatively small amounts of money to kids who are talented and don't have a penny, who want to go to colleges that cost a lot of money. And he would say that getting those kids through school is a transformational piece of philanthropy, and I think it's every bit as much so as the whole high school change movement. I'm now told that the famous but elusive Nancy Roberts may be online. Are you there, Nancy?
Coming in.
Okay, Nancy, that's it. Go back to Hartford. Go back to the Lyceum.
Go to a
Good thing
poll.
you said maybe
now,
rather
we're going to go out for our last poll to the broader cyberspace. And here's the question. In our October program, we looked at why foundations were involved or afraid to get involved in public policy. And this is slide 21 for those of you here in Boston. And we found several factors about what that was. Education, learning what qualifies as lobbying, for instance, long-term commitment, fear of failure, some of the very things we've talked about here today. But here's a question. We're talking about the big issues. We're talking about where leadership is needed. What are some of the big areas in your minds where philanthropy could play more of a leadership role? And we're asking you to pick one, both those of you off-site through the web and those of you here. Poverty and inequity, environmental degradation, human rights abuses, universal health care and insurance, global disease and health, urban decay and sprawl, or urban policy in general, civic engagement and citizenship, which has already been referenced on the panel, weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. Which ones do you think we really need to do more in? We need to play more of a leadership. And while we're tabulating those who are on the web, how about here in Boston? Who would offer their choice of which one of these? We have a offer from the woman in the middle of the hall there, whose name I don't know. Say your name.
Felice Mendel.
Hey, Felice.
Hi. I would pick poverty and inequity. I think, years ago when welfare reform was hitting, I read something by Lester Thoreau, who talked about there's an inherent contradiction between democracy and capitalism. And in terms of survival, democracy being everybody being equal, and capitalism somewhat being about survival of the fittest. And the only thing that really allows the coexistence of the two is the safety net and really doing away with those inequities. And I guess my question is, how can philanthropy, it goes back to the idea of philanthropy as a catalyst, the philanthropic sector as a catalyst, and how can it take a leadership role in terms of really changing the dialogue and the concept and everything else in terms of the public sector and corporate world and everybody else about really dealing with the growing inequities?
So your question is, in addition to saying you think poverty, your question is about the process. What is that process? Sandy Manzella over there, do you have a right to the back? Keep going. You're almost there, Jane. Keep going. Raise your hand, Sandy. Which one of these do you think, if you had to pick one, where that philanthropy should play more of a leader in?
You may not like my answer, Peter, but I was going to add one.
Go ahead, add one. We want that.
The role of women in society. I just think there's no attention played to the positive role when women aren't educated, when women don't have access to health care, just the tremendous impact it has on society, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan. So I guess that makes me a disruptor, Peter.
Okay, disruptor. I'll remember not to call on you next time. Thank you very much. Yep, David Ford.
Another disruptive comment. There are absolutely amazing foundations working hard on every single one of these issues, and the one that you just mentioned. And that's the joy of our sector. And I don't think we should resist that. It is the independent sector. We, both as charities and as donors, get to choose what we want to do. And there's not one of these issues that is not having millions of dollars spent on it across the country. And I think that's just wonderful.
Let me turn to the panel with this question. And in terms of others, we know there are many that could be on here. In fact, Bruce Sievers, who has a chapter in the book Just Money that both Michelle Corton-Brown and David Ford, who's here, also have, raises some other issues. I'll just mention them to the panel. The mass media as an unrecognized area, or an area that hasn't been approached much, with civil society, which we have mentioned, ethical issues, we have touched on that, and what he labels the intercultural war. And there's a huge amount of literature and argument around the culture war in this country, in this society, which is to some degree referenced in the Sleepwalker essay.
Eric, in that if I ever went back to philanthropy, would be exactly where I would focus, is on a program on public sector effectiveness, making government work better again, building public trust and public appreciation in our institutions of government, working on issues of recruitment, retention, and professional development amongst the people who work in government, because in every one of these areas, we are also dependent upon the effectiveness of government, and we have some real significant crises in our public sector that we could address generically by focusing in on how to strengthen the capacity of government to fulfill on government's functions. And I have been absolutely discouraged and dismayed over the past 20 years at just how little work is done on the issue of public sector effectiveness.
Another is, obviously I'm biased, but from Horace Mann on, we have made public education in this country one of the great places to create diversity and experience, a common experience. And in this winner-take-all world that we seem to be in now, there's too many that would think the private sector has all the solutions. And granted, moving public education from a place where it served the needs of the society in the 20th century to what it needs to do in the 21st century is damn complex. But we can do this if we believe in it and have the will. Why I was anxious for you to read that poem at the end, to do it. And if we can preserve public education as a fundamental part of the American democratic system.
guess I will continue to be a disruptor with David. I think the joy of the sector is that all these things are important, and I resist trying to say this one is the most important. If I knew that there was anthrax about to be released in the next hour, I'd say that's the most important versus, something else that I could pit to. But I would say with each of these issues that we tend to shy away from the underlying issues of race and gender, and how they differentially impact each one of these issues. And I would say that whatever that special issue is that you choose, look at the differential impacts that often result from race and gender. And then the last thing, know what your theory of change is. This is going back to the earlier transformational question from Miss Anonymous. And to say that you need to know what it is you want to change and how to know when you've gotten there. And I think too often we talk about we want societal change and transformation, but we're never explicit. This isn't measurement. This is setting, I want to get to the top of this hill. I want to know what it looks like. And too often we don't talk about what it ought to look like, and therefore we waste time on efforts that could never get us there.
Interesting. I think the question, as all these questions are somewhat arbitrary in their selection of pieces. And one thing that we've learned in the TPI experience is that what people often struggle with is finding that passion, finding which one of these things really does grab them, and figuring out what they can do about it. And we find that lack of knowing is part of what holds donors back, that holds people back, because it's so confusing, they're so overwhelming. Stephen, do we have, however, from our audience out in the web land, an answer to this question?
We do. The virtual jury has spoken. It again mirrors the live audience and the panel. Poverty and inequity is the overwhelming choice. Coming in a distant second is civic engagement, and followed by environmental degradation.
Interesting. In the Sleepwalker essay, I made these comments of what we wanted, what we hoped we would find, and they were these: a society that has enough common sense to understand and bravery to admit that goodwill and building bridges is neither naive or dangerous. This is slide 22 for those of you here. A we that represents a broad and open public purpose and supports the citizen-driven process that inhabits the public commons and that has the humility to fund the structure of an open society. Philanthropy dedicated to the promotion of citizenship and civic values and to the education of society, especially the young, and a philanthropic sector willing to roll up its sleeves and seriously address the critical issues in America and around the world, especially poverty, but others as well. And it's interesting how the discussion here today has really been around every one of those themes and touched on any one of those themes. And I would like to ask the panel this question, which is really a sort of a final question, and it goes to what specific advice do you have for those who aspire to be a philanthropic leader? What are the steps? What are the specifics? Michelle, do you want to begin with that discussion?
I've actually been taking some mental notes during this conversation because for me, those who aspire to be philanthropic leaders got a lot of good fodder here today. And I just took a couple of notes, and I think that a philanthropic leader needs to possess a vision, courage, passion, values, flexibility, active listening skills, and the willingness to collaborate.
You know anyone?
Well, I think of some modern examples. I think Bill Gates and his ability to partner and to put huge dollars behind issues is pretty inspiring. I can think of a dozen more, but that's one that stands out.
Great. Tim?
Well, I think one of the things I've been hearing today is when we talk about transformational leadership, that you can see transformational leadership after it's happened, not only by the action or the change itself, but the fact that people think about the issue in a different way. It fundamentally changes the way people think about the issue. And I think, to add on to what you were saying, Peter, about the importance of people finding their passion in the work they're doing, I was having trouble, like David, I think, answering the question about which issue should more focus be given to. And I guess the meta issue for me is, how do we help people find whatever their passion is, whatever issue they care deeply about, and then how do we support people in taking action based on that. So I know you're going to do some poetry, so I have this is not original poetry, but our daughter loves Shel Silverstein, and so one that I use a lot in talking about the importance of action, bias for action, is his poem on the woulda, coulda, shouldas. It goes something like this. I don't have it verbatim, but all the woulda, coulda, shouldas sitting in the sun, thinking about all the things they woulda, coulda, shoulda done. Yet all those characters just ran away and hid from just one little did.
I like that a lot, but also I like what you said earlier, that for you the big piece is how you help people find their passions, because for 15 years that has really been the central piece of what TPI has tried to do and is still trying to do. Peter.
I think philanthropy is an art, not a science, and that to be a leader in philanthropy, you have to learn to be an artist and not a scientist.
And with that, I would refer you to the book Just Money, which has the essay by Dennis Collins of Philanthropy as an Art that I think tells that in lovely ways.
Three things around philanthropic leadership. One, leadership requires courage. It requires the ability to know that people are going to disagree with you. Second, I think, as we've talked about, it takes vision and values. You have to know where you're going, and you have to be centered around a set of values about how you want to get there. And then third, I think every philanthropic institution has cash and cachet. I think we're very used to using our cash. I think we don't use our cachet at all. And I think, in fact, our cachet may have a lot more power, a lot more leverage to provide leadership in what we do around important community issues, because we'll have a little bit of money. We have a large cachet if we use it accurately.
Simply, in the words of Gandhi, you must be the change you wish to see.
Does anyone here in Boston have a comment about, or advice, or out of your own experience around what you would say to someone who aspires to be a philanthropic leader? Any customers? All you shy folk?
I think that there are probably lots of examples, and I think that both big and small, and I think that we need to do lots more to shine the light on the philanthropic leadership that's being exercised in lots of ways, and to sort of be a model and a mentor for those who want to be philanthropic leaders. I think that there's, you've talked about lots of different types, including the quiet leadership. And I think that there just needs to be more highlighting of a lot of the rich leadership that may be going on in lots of different ways. And again, particularly I would say within specific issues, as a way of encouraging others to do something similar.
We have a question coming up from Center.
I just wanted to mention a couple of other things. One that came up earlier, I think doggedness and persistence are really, really critical, just staying with something for a long period of time. And then the other thing that I think is really critical is the reality that it's important that other people have the credit for it, and that, you know, we're not going to be in the business necessarily of having the credit, but it's really other people, and that's what I've often seen things happen when that happens.
Thank you, Beth Smith.
Peter, I'm just going to give you a plug because I'm holding a copy of the book, and you should tell people how to get it.
The book, Just Money, A Critique of Contemporary American Philanthropy, is available from the TPI website. I think we're going to end the conference, and I'm going to do so with, first of all, a tremendous thank you to our panel. You were great, and I mean that. You really were. It was inspiring, and we all learned a lot, and I thank you all for coming, especially those of you who, in the midst of an already overwhelming travel life, agreed to come to Boston, Filene's notwithstanding. I want to remind everyone in our audience, both here and in Boston and elsewhere, to complete the survey, which is really important for us to know. And I also want to announce to you that we have a save the date for October 26th for another one of our Tuesdays at TPI. This is a very special one. It's called The Heart of the Matter, and it will be a celebration of TPI's 15 years of reflection on the subject of generosity, and that's October 26th. One of the definitions or notions on leadership that's in the materials from Walter Lippmann, and he says this: the final test of a leader is that he leaves behind in others the conviction and will to carry on. And the notion of will is one that I've thought a lot about. I think it's hugely important. And this is the poem called Will that Chad Wick referenced earlier. It was actually written for a friend who was a panelist in March 9th. It was written for Peter Goldmark, who was then president of the Rockefeller Foundation. I wrote this for him for his board when he stepped down from that position, because he is someone who I think has these elements. Will. It's a matter of will, this game of life is inner rather than outer. Conception is nice, but doesn't express will, while execution, oh yes. No prescriptions here, yet focus drives closure. Organizations are built, survive, and prosper based on will, one or multiple. Governments fail from lack. Fortunes rise and fall, and great art is made by force of. You won't find will in resumes. It isn't always noisy and often lies deep. Obsession, while not will, is part of the intensity, which is a precondition. The aha components are passion and huge ambition all over a good idea. Will, unromanticized, along with love, it is our most powerful. Thank you all very much for being with us today, and safe travels.
And don't forget, there is a reception beginning immediately in the lobby.
But there is. But those of you who are not in Boston cannot come to the reception, but we'll have a drink in your name.